Welcome, everybody, to the Vermont Climate Council Science and Data Subcommittee meeting for June 9th. We have another full agenda today. Plan for the agenda is go over the meeting minutes. We'll do our kind of round the council updates from the liaisons and other miscellaneous updates for the council, and then talk a little bit about a kind of a revised way of looking at the work plan and kind of mapping out our tasks for the summer at a really high level. I only sent that out this morning, so hopefully you had a chance to look at it, but understand if you don't, you didn't. And that's okay for today, I think. And then at around 2:45, Taylor Bennington from Stockholm Energy Institute will be joining us to talk about the initial results from the business as usual reference case modeling that we've all been working on. And then time for public comment towards the end. Does anybody have any additions to or objections to the agenda? Hearing none, we can move ahead as planned. Next up on the agenda is the minutes. I did see one copy editing out and put in the chat. Thank you, Jared, about the minutes to reflect the correct commenter's name. Are there any other comments on the minutes? Any objections to approving the minutes with that one copy edited change? Hearing none, I think this is the first agenda item we've ever been ahead of schedule on. I could just feel that sarcasm coming through, Julie. Thank you. And now we're back on schedule. Good. So miscellaneous updates and around the council. Jane, I guess I'll throw it to you to start because I know you have one exciting update.
Okay, yes. I'll do the exciting one first, but so we are officially under contract for our technical analysis work with Cadmus. And so I'm not sure if they're joining us today or any of their members are, but I forwarded the invitation and your materials to Cadmus staff because I know they're interested in seeing the business as usual model, and we'll be working closely with SEI going forward. So if they're not joining today, they were going to try to join tomorrow for cross-sector where a similar presentation is going to happen. So that feels like big.
This is David Hill, and I'm part of the Cadmus team with EFG.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm on, and a couple others will be joining us at 2:45 for the SEI presentation.
Oh, David Hill, thank you for introducing yourself. I haven't met you yet,
Sure.
so
Yep.
Appreciate you being here, and we're
Nice to
really
meet you.
excited to move forward. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So I'll just pause there and see if anybody has any questions about what's next with that. But I will say that we're working to set up sort of a kickoff meeting on Monday with the project team that Cadmus is working to pull the right people in. And to remind everybody that first up is the greenhouse gas inventory work, as well as refining and finalizing a methodology for the carbon budget. So we'll be thinking about those tasks right out of the gate, as well as the capacity that Cadmus and others bring on the team to the LEAP modeling so that we can think about advancing any additional contractual work with SEI to ensure that they have enough capacity to work with us through this. So those are the first things that we'll be thinking about, and I'll just leave it at that unless there's any questions.
Welcome, David, and everybody from the team.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, David, please do feel free as we start with SEI later to introduce others that join on so that we all can put face to names.
Okay.
And then second, I thought I would just, I wasn't sure to do this first or second, but just wanted to recognize Dr. Bindu Panikar, who's joined us today. And just thank you for sitting in on the meeting today and thinking about perhaps your participation in the subcommittee going forward. So please don't hesitate to join in as a full committee member, even though you're somewhat temporary today in auditing us, but we really appreciate having you here and think that hopefully the work planning conversation and stuff will shed some light on the direction of the next few weeks and next bit of substance for the meetings that we'll hopefully introduce you to.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for letting me sit in. It's really nice to kind of learn firsthand what this committee is about, and then decide accordingly. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I can't think of, I'm sure there's other updates, but I can't think of anything else more pertinent than the fact that the cabinet team is on board right now. So we did have a steering committee meeting on Monday and spoke mostly about the timeline associated with the July 26th Climate Council meeting and the development of strategies out of the Rural Resilience, Ag and Ecosystems and Cross-Sector meeting for that council meeting, as well as the rollout of the guiding principles and scoring rubric associated with it from the Just Transitions Subcommittee. And I will just highlight that you'll notice that they're not on your agenda today, but that rather than a separate agenda for you all at your subcommittee meeting, I expect that either today or by early tomorrow, you'll be receiving a memo associated with the draft documents and then an invitation to join them for a workshop on the thought process behind their development and consideration for receiving your comments and edits for next Thursday evening between 4 and 6 in lieu of their regularly scheduled meetings. So that's forthcoming, and I look forward to seeing how that rolls out. I did just notice that Gabrielle joined us too, who I know is part of ESG. So nice to have you with us. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Jane, for those updates. Next up is to really just go around and talk about the interactions with the other subcommittees and kind of building off what you just mentioned, Jane. I'm going to turn it over to Jared to start with communications with Just Transitions Committee.
Great, thanks, TJ. And TJ or Claire, who I believe is on, please add to this as well. But I guess 2 days ago on Monday, TJ and Claire and I, and Claire has been really helpfully attending both the Just Transitions and the Science and Data Subcommittee meetings. I think that's our main point of overlap there, but had a great meeting with Sue Minter and Sarah Phillips. Hey, Claire, co-chairs of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and Russ McDonald and Kashka to discuss. We wanted to make sure we were getting their feedback and questions and input on the draft work plan. And so that was really helpful in terms of thinking about both data gaps that we're recognizing we may need to fill in the short term, or may need to in the longer term figure out, how we're going to address. There were also some good conversations about, how we make sure that throughout the work plan, we are basically requesting and seeking data in a way that allows us to do equity analysis, and where it's not possible to do so, to note those data gaps and kind of future data needs and wants. So, it was really helpful they've have a copy of the work plan and, may provide further feedback. We're going to schedule some further check-ins, especially once some of the work is underway with the contractors. And I believe that Kashka is going to join us as a liaison, who, in addition to Claire, will be sitting in on both the Just Transitions and the Science and Data Subcommittee meetings. So we've got another point of contact for helpful kind of communication and coordination. I think those are the main pieces, but TJ, Claire, please feel free to add.
Thanks, Jared. Just one thing that I discovered, I guess, that I didn't realize, or I had forgotten, that in the Just Transitions Committee scope, it actually calls out our committee, not in our scope, but in theirs, and in that they intend to work particularly with our committee on identifying and evaluating the state's most vulnerable and at-risk communities, including the use of vulnerability indices and mapping, and then with an intention to make data more inclusive and fill historical gaps, and two, to promote state sound investments in low emission, job rich sectors and technologies. So I just wanted to point that out in terms of a couple of things that are happening. I think there's one of the other subcommittees is doing a municipality vulnerability index, which we might hear a little bit about more, but also just what is already on our work plan, at least generally, in terms of identifying gaps in data and making recommendations as to whether they need to be filled, and if so, how to fill them. And so we had our conversation. I think it was really helpful and probably overdue, but I think there was this kind of almost like an expectation that we would be able to actually provide data this summer, and at least the communication back, and we can fix that if this was wrong, but we framed it more as really that what we have in our work plan is identifying the data needs and finding ways to fill them in the short term, and that actually doing data gathering and filling them, that may be a task for in the future if it's recommended that we need to go that path. So I just wanted to add that as an interesting part of the conversation. So go ahead.
Yeah, and I'll also just note that there was one really, I thought, exciting and promising update on progress in terms of data collection that Sarah Phillips shared, which is, one of the equity principles that Just Transitions has shared with us is that it's not just important to look through the lens of equity at future possible programs and policies that would be proposed, but at existing programs and policies. And one of the challenges that I think we've had at a state level is that there's a lot of program data, whether it's tier 3 programs or incentives that Efficiency Vermont has, or state incentive programs, that it's been really difficult for us to disaggregate by demographic groups. It's generally easier to do on the income side, especially the program that Sarah helps lead in terms of low income weatherization through the Office of Economic Opportunity, because that's part of the criteria for the program is an income qualification. But she shared with us that starting July 1st, that program is going to be collecting for the first time data on program participants' race. So we'll have a better lens into potential disparities or inequities that may or may not exist, and I feel like part of the work going forward is making sure that the benefits, the programs and services that exist or will be designed are going to communities that have been impacted in frontline. So I thought that was a promising example that we're probably going to need and want a lot more of in terms of data collection on the. But that was a promising bit of news that for the first time they'll be collecting that information.
Jane, you want to chime in?
Yeah, just as an interesting comment, as an addendum to what you were just speaking to, Jared, one of the things that comes up often in just transitions and ag and ecosystems where we have Indigenous participation is that they don't answer those kinds of questions. That's so just an interesting thing to think about. Anyway, the second, the reason I had raised my hand was around the Municipal Vulnerability Index and calling to question a need for coordination at a multiple committee level around that, because rural resilience is sort of moving full steam ahead with the idea of working with within the parameters of the Green Mountain Power tool. And Green Mountain Power has a DEI grant, a Department of Energy grant, not DEI, Department of Energy grant that funds that work, and they have capacity there to sort of add in whatever data sets that we want to sort of enrich the Green Mountain Power tool. But the issue has come up that many of the data sets we'd like to add in around land cover, land use kind of don't exist. And it seems to come into overlap with some of the questions that like Lauren Oates and Ag and Ecosystems have raised around data sets that are of interest to them for their work. And so it almost feels like some multifaceted group to get together to sort of think about what's possible within the parameters of the Green Mountain Power Municipal Vulnerability, taking that to become a Municipal Vulnerability Index, and then what the future data needs are to enrich that. And there were a bunch of folks identified as a task group in rural resilience to facilitate that, but it would be great to sort of think about that and how it pertains to this subcommittee also. And then one thing I'll just say that I'm thinking a lot about since you spoke about the equity assessment on existing policies and programs, as well as application for the strategies and work programs and policy recommendations that come out of this work, the Climate Council work. I'm just thinking about how we're going to do that, like how we're going to administer running all of our strategies and recommendations through that. So just putting a pin in that the scoring rubric, one of the things about the scoring rubric, as you'll learn next week, is it takes something that's very subjective as a person who's running it through, evaluating it, and makes it appear objective by putting a number on it. And so I'm worried that if all the subcommittees have different task group leads applying it, that it's going to be done in a very uneven fashion across the subcommittee work. So anyway, I think there'll need to be some thought in how we use that tool in a consistent manner.
Yeah, thanks, Jan. And maybe we can think about that, after the 17th, after we kind of get the presentation on what it is and how they suggest it be used. Richard, you want to chime in?
I'm having a bit of a hard time functioning at this level of generality, so I apologize. I'm going to ask a very, very specific question. What do we know empirically about what happens to energy use in low-income homes when they're weatherized? Do we have a good? I mean, we know what the theoretical gains should be, but what are the empirical gains?
Yeah, the quick answer to that is a 20 to 25% reduction in energy use for each unit weatherized on average.
Okay, so that's based on empirical data on before and after.
Blower doors before and after tests.
No, not blower doors, bills.
Utility
bills.
I don't believe it's based on bills, because that then introduces some different variables of change in, could be change in use.
Well, exactly. And that's why I'm asking about empirical evidence of what happens to energy consumption, what happens to CO2 release when you do weatherization projects. So, I'm not trying to give you a hard time here.
Yeah, so I'm having trouble just tying this to, is there a question that we need to, are we trying to get data on, or
Well,
and
so-
how it
so-
relates to one of our work plan topics?
So if one of the goals ends up being to reduce greenhouse gases from heating buildings,
Mhm.
okay, and one of our strategies for doing that is to weatherize homes that need it. So we ought to be able to estimate how much impact we'll have on greenhouse gas releases by our program, because that's the purpose of the program. And I imagine that when people get their homes weatherized, and I think this happened at our house, and their bills go down a bit, then they turn the thermostat up a little because they would really like to have the thermostat a little higher, and they couldn't afford it before, and now they can. Okay, so I don't think it's as simple as just measuring the blower door leakage.
Right. So that is just, I was trying to be concise, and I oversimplified it, and we could talk offline. The department does a lot of evaluations on the state's weatherization programs. So the Efficiency Vermont side that does start to get into that, what the rebound effect is of efficiency, if there is one, and those types of things. So I want to just kind of put a pin in that, though, so we can.
No, that's fine. I don't want to take
yeah.
any more time here.
Right.
If I have a larger purpose, it's to keep us focused on the goal line, which is to reduce greenhouse gas production. And we need to know how our investments are affecting that bottom line,
Right.
with whatever intervention we choose.
And I would throw out that there's a big distinction between bills and usage.
No, I
Right, so-
was viewing bills as a place that has information about usage. I wasn't
Correct.
thinking about the dollar amount.
Right.
But thanks. Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Richard. And let's follow up offline, and we can talk about that a little more and where it fits in. Bindu, would you like to chime in? Oh, you're on mute still. Yeah, right.
Sorry, great to hear, this discussion on the data needs, and also recognizing that there are major data gaps in the existing data that's available. So I know the Department of Health has actually done a vulnerability assessment. It's not complete by any means. The number of variables that can be added within that vulnerability assessment can be broadened to actually get a better understanding of it. But also related to this is that we talked about income, we talked about race, but I think another important component is that of ability, because there are a lot of, a disability is something that we are not really taking into consideration, which should be part of the data assessment. But another project that I'm working on is actually looking into how food, energy, water nexus is incorporated within coastal resilience planning. And we're also looking into how issues related to, diversity, equity, and inclusion is also included as part of this coastal resilience plans. And we're looking at it across the US. We're looking at about over a dozen plans, and to see what actions are proposed and how they're implemented. And, what we're realizing, Boston probably has one of the best plans that is also including aspects of, DEIJ. Not many of the coastal resilience plans are actually doing a good job of incorporating built infrastructural issues like food, energy, water systems in it. And considering Vermont, its focus on agriculture, its focus on dairy, I'm wondering, as we're thinking about data, gathering data, we're trying to, beginning to think about this from a DEIJ perspective. But I'm also kind of thinking, how are we thinking about this also from a very infrastructural perspective to some extent. Oftentimes we kind of like go down to a household unit base of analysis. But I think, the social service infrastructure, could be included as part of this and could be an innovative, model that we could be building in doing something like this. There are a couple of resilience plans that are actually including food, water, energy, nexus issues, but not thoroughly. But I think in Vermont, because of its interest in renewable energy and food systems and water and bodies of water pollution, also linked to agriculture and all of that, I think I can see a lot of things that can be actually addressed in terms of like reducing carbon emissions within these systems, but also having not just a nexus approach, but also a DIJ approach in kind of the data, demands that we're making.
Sorry, I was on mute, my turn. Thank you for that. Well, one, I'm not sure if you've shared this in those studies in other venues or those plans, like the Boston plan, or I think it'd be great if you could share that. You could either send it to Jared or me or Jane, and we can get it out to the committee.
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. So we can see how they're looking at data. And one of our tasks on the work plan is really related to data and how we collect it. It kind of permeates through all the other tasks, but it also is kind of its own standalone, so that we can have a home for it, but to kind of a intentional way of addressing it. And I think the issues that we may be able to see from those examples of both where they're having success and where there may be more to do, that we could kind of flow that in there and look at that.
Data platforms is something that I've seen referred to, and a collaborative grounds up way of building that data platform is something that I have seen. Could be something that we could try, and again, mapping based portals are also very popular. So I'm not completely sure what is the vision of this group, but I'm just
thank you for that. I think we're kind of figuring out still what we can accomplish in the short term and what we can tee up for long term. And so this is all really, really valuable. So recognizing now that we're on our usual course of being outside of our agenda time frame, I do want to give a moment to see if there's any other updates from our liaisons to either ag or the resilience community. More than we've kind of blended them together here, but more than what's already been said. Okay. So hearing none, I think we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is really to talk a little bit more. This is always an agenda item and may always be, but we'll really trying to plan out for the summer what our committee can accomplish and will accomplish. And in reviewing the work plan that we had and some of the questions that were were coming up, we noticed that, noticed, I think it's obvious that the technical consultants, so EFG and Cadmus will have, have a big role to play for our committee. And so really we started to take a look at how can our committee really best interact with the consultants to move the work of our subcommittee forward. And based on what some of the other subcommittees have done, they kind of translated their work plan into a real planning document in Excel, where it kind of laid out some tasks, times when we could talk about it, presentations, deliberation time, and actions. And that's what that Excel document that was sent out this morning is about. I'm going to pull that up now, just to give you a sense of it. Bear with me, please. Okay, can folks see that now? Okay, so I can only see a couple of you, so if you have your hand raised, you might just have to join. Yeah, thank you. Or you might just have to chime in. And so you'll see these topics and tasks are the same ones that you've seen in the work plan that we've had. I sent out a revised version of the work plan as well, but as you go down, greenhouse gas inventory, carbon budget is called out separately here, the LEAP modeling, climate data and modeling, human health impacts, social cost of carbon, and identification of data gaps. Last time that was going to up with the LEAP modeling, but we had talked about making that its own item. And what I did, I just added it to kind of the data monitoring and assessment strategy here in this task. And then the bottom half of the spreadsheet here is what I was trying to describe of what might happen at the subcommittee meeting. So presenting, whether we're planning, briefs, like brief updates from the task leads, which we would expect to happen, deliberation and decision points. So the one of the goals that I was hoping to get out of this, and the substance of here and how it translated from the work plan, I'd like to not focus on too much, because that was really done just this week and is the draft. We have to make sure everything got translated well, but really to frame out generally who the task leads are for each of these items, so that then we can actually get some work done, and they can be the interaction with the technical consultant where that is required. Not all of these tasks have that interaction, or able to kind of take a charge from subcommittee deliberations and go off and do work and bring it back to the subcommittee, so that we're making progress in between subcommittee meetings. And I guess before I go any further, does that conceptually sound reasonable to folks? And Jared, I don't know if you want to add anything to how I frame this up.
No, that sounds great, TJ. And my sense is also that one of the, correct me if I'm doing this out of order, TJ, but I think we want to make sure that we're capturing folks' interests and commitments in terms of, assuming this looks good, being able to identify some task leads or task groups that, and defer to your process on how we're going to surface those names. I know we've done that a little bit already, but I feel like we didn't want that to be set in stone, especially since we have some new members of the subcommittee and give folks a chance to kind of shift around if their kind of interests or time commitments have changed.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there questions or comments on this kind of structure? One thing I'll point out, and I think it's to be determined, this is structured right now as weekly, and I'm not sure. Well, once we get into the substance, maybe that will become clear that we need weekly, or things could be both together bi-weekly. But I just wanted to point that out to say that right now, all of our calendars have weekly appointments, but understanding that that's a big time commitment and it's hard to do stuff in between these weekly if the meetings are weekly. So, Richard.
I'm looking at the box for today under greenhouse gas inventory, and it says pick a point person. And I'm kind of interested in that, but I want to ask a question about this. The greenhouse gas inventory that the state has produced up until now has various assumptions, has various decisions embedded in it about how we're going to count greenhouse gases from various sources. And I'm not going to review what all those are, but there, I've identified previously, there are 3 or 4 or 5 places where decisions are embedded. Is it our assumption that those same decisions will be carried over into our analyses of the impact of of interventions under the climate change program?
So the way I've been looking at this, and feel free anybody to correct me where I'm wrong, but is that it's our job to review those methodologies and assumptions and make any recommendations for changes to them with the technical consultants' help. And if we're making recommendations for changes, then I think the timing of those changes need to be considered. So for instance, if we were recommending or changes or additions. So if, for instance, we said we need to do, this subcommittee recommends that a life cycle analysis should be done, and that should be done in addition to the current one, and we could set out a timing, or even it could, I don't know that we would go there, but it could recommend replacing it, but that clearly isn't going to be done for this climate action plan anyway. There's other assumptions that could be, I think, theoretically incorporated into this, not into the analysis for the climate action plan. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but
it partially does. But I mean, I imagine that we're going to propose a suite of interventions, actions that the state is going to take or other actors are going to take that collectively are going to be the climate plan, right? And for each of those, you would like to be able to estimate how big the impact is going to be on the desired outcome from each of those interventions. And you're going to end up using the same greenhouse warming potentials. You're going to use a value for greenhouse warming potential in each of those estimates. Now, I'm thinking that we would want to use the same value in the greenhouse gas inventory that we use in assessing the impact of interventions. But maybe you have a different idea. Maybe there's a different strategy.
So the timing of those, so the cross-sector mitigation committee is going to be recommending strategies in July. I don't think that we will have, recommendations. I'll just say it this way: those strategies won't reflect any recommendations that this committee comes up with for changing the or modifying, if it comes up with any, the climate inventory.
Well, I find that disappointing.
So I don't blame you. I've mentioned that before in this whole in the process, and that's not to say that those are the final recommendations that the cross-sector mitigation committee comes up with. And so I'm hopeful that as the process goes throughout the summer and the fall, that then can be merged so that we can reflect the recommendations of this subcommittee on the climate inventory, because there's certain measures, you've brought this up before, there's certain measures, depending on how you count, they may not be, you may come to a different decision on what you recommend. And I completely agree with what I've understood you to say before. And I think that's where we are right now.
Well,
I'm not sure if anybody else wants to comment on that.
You know, if at least by the end of by this fall, we can come back post facto and estimate the likely impact of the interventions, that's something.
Yeah, TJ, if I could, that was part of what I was going to flag, is I do think that there are this is a living document, the climate action plan. We have a firm deadline of December 1st to adopt this initial plan. But I don't harbor any illusions that it's sort of done, even for the work needed to get to the 2025 reduction requirements when we adopted on December 1st. And so there are a lot of challenges that we've talked about at length regarding the overall timing for this work. And this is also one of them. And I think it's just a commitment to an ongoing refinement, and appreciate very much the considerations you're raising, Richard. I think from my vantage as the A&R secretary, we also have considerations around some of the issues Megan O'Toole had flagged in her presentation previously about their statutory obligations. We also have in terms of how we report this information. So there's a lot of nuance and complications in this space. And I think we just have to sort of remain committed to doing the best job we can with the time we have, and to continuing to work on it as we build towards 2050.
I think it's also worth, thank you, Secretary Moore. I think it's also worth pausing to note that there's a lot of nuance here in terms of the different roles and responsibilities. And it was really helpful, Megan's presentation, and maybe she wants to speak to it, or you do, Secretary Moore, but I just want to make sure that I'm operating with the right assumptions, or at least the same assumptions as others are. And that is that, you know, it is specifically called out in the Global Warming Solutions Act that the climate action plan that we submit in December should identify the means to accurately measure the state's greenhouse gas emissions and progress towards meeting the reduction requirements. But in terms of how that gets operationalized, in terms of the actual methodology, the kind of rules that are chosen, you know, my sense is that is a decision that's ultimately either going to be up to A&R within their purview, or is going to be legislatively directed, which, you know, our recommendations may play a role in that, and, you know, in either of those scenarios. But my sense is that our job is to review the information, do as good a job as we can with the consultants to frame up some of the key choices and pros and cons and different considerations, but that it will ultimately be a series of recommendations but the final decision will lie with what the legislature decides to direct, and or what A&R decides to how to move forward.
Well, I've always thought, you know, as a public official, which I'm not anymore, but I used to be, you know, I play one on TV now, but as a public official, I always thought that if I could give the decision makers, the legislature and the governor's appointees, a clear quantitative sense of the likely consequence of their decisions, that I'd done my job. And I get that, okay? But I hate to be doing it post facto rather than prospectively, that's all.
This is David, if I can just offer a couple comments. I think, Secretary Moore, what you're saying, it's an ongoing process everywhere. Every jurisdiction is to some degree facing the questions around accounting and changes to accounting as the science changes and other things like that. And then Richard, your points are very well taken, and they are well suited, say, for different global warming potentials. The LEAP tool and sensitivity analysis can handle that. So we can run something with alternative global warming potentials relatively easily and say this would be the, you know, to inform the decision making. for ANR or others on the mitigation options. So I think without necessarily knowing what the final accounting parameters and specifications will be up front, we can still do work that will help to inform that decision.
Thanks.
And I would just offer, Richard, as well, and to everyone, that I think, you know, this isn't totally going to be after the fact, because as we built EAN's emissions reduction pathways analysis, in terms of the assumptions we use around greenhouse gas reduction from different measures and actions, those were borrowed directly from the technical resource manual and follow the existing conventions that ANR is using. And those can be updated, as David said, the LEAP model can as well. The one exception to that is that we found it very difficult to model emissions reductions around measures that have to do with biofuels, because the total emissions reduction varies so much depending on what you're assuming around some of the life cycle analysis, especially around renewable natural gas and around biodiesel. But everything else, you know, it is basically following the existing methodology that the state is using and could be updated if changes get made to that. It's just an updating of the assumptions, but the model wouldn't fundamentally need to change. For the other, I mentioned that because the cross-sector mitigation committee is currently utilizing the EAN pathways model and as a starting point until we get more information from the LEAP modeling exercise and from Cadmus and EFG.
So I spent 30 years as a public health official, and you know, we got authoritative guidance from the Centers for Disease Control and from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. And our default position was we're going to follow the CDC guidance, you know, which is sort of the equivalent of this manual that you're talking about. But we reserved the right from time to time to say, no, we think they're wrong, or their methods don't apply in our state, or our situation really is different. And from time to time, we would say, no, for good reason, we're going to do this a different way. But you need to be prepared to defend that decision and to show why you think that was the right choice. But I think you also need to be prepared to defend the decision to follow standard methods.
Right, and you can't defend that unless you evaluate other options. So I'm hearing, Richard, that you would like to be on this team as or the task lead even for the greenhouse gas inventory and engaging with the consultant to kind of help move us forward and make sure the questions that you and the rest of the committee have already identified. I think we've done more here than in other areas, but so those questions are being responded to.
But it's not like I don't have enough to do already, but yes, this is the piece I'm most interested in.
Right.
And I put it in the chat, but similarly, I would be happy to work with Richard, and I presume hopefully folks from ANR on that as well.
Okay, so hopefully you all can see putting in task group leads. Yes, presumably it's staff from ANR will be on that as well. I'm not sure if Colin, you're here, but I'm volunteering you. Sorry, Julie.
I would have done so myself.
Okay. Sorry. So folks, when this screen share is up, I have a hard time seeing the chat. It just flashes at me, and then I hesitate for a minute to find it. So
TJ, Brian just volunteered for either cost of carbon or the carbon budget.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brian. So in terms of carbon budget, this somebody emailed to me, said this, and it's probably right. Carbon budget and greenhouse gas inventory, in some respects, are two sides of the same coin. And so I'm not sure if it makes sense to have overlap in those two, or how we want to move forward. And the other thing I'll note is that I think it's the rural resilience. No, I'm sorry. Well, Jane, you could correct me which committee it is. It's probably Ag and Ecosystems is the one that's very interested in carbon budget and has this as a piece of their work plan as well. Is that right?
Yeah, and Dave Coster and Ryan Patch are co-leading that task group.
Who is the
They've
first
actually
one?
met as a group, Billy Coster
Okay.
and Ryan Patch. Yeah, so they've met as a group now too. So mostly because there was some back and forth around like what we were thinking of for a carbon budget through conversations and review of the proposals that we got for the technical analysis that led to interest in having an initial meeting to discuss, to get on the same page, so to speak.
Okay. Is there anybody else who would like to support Brian in leading this up for our committee? I think there's a lot of overlap between the two committees, and it'd be good to have more than one person on each of these tasks. Somebody's raising their hand. I can't see it.
I don't see any hands.
Okay. Well, I am going to leave it there, but Brian, I think you should feel free to reach out to folks to get more input as necessary. So for the LEAP modeling, I obviously would be a task on the task group, and Claire from the Department of Public Service has been participating and would be in that group, and other department staff also. Is there anybody else from the committee that would like to be involved in the interaction of the LEAP model with the technical consultants and this committee?
Yeah, TJ, I'd like to be involved in that.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Lo.
And TJ, you can't see it, but I put in the chat as well.
Okay, I was expecting your hand to go up, Jared, so I was surprised when I didn't see anything. So, great. So climate data impacts and modeling, and this one is actually a little fleshed out, a little less fleshed out in the work plan, but Jay and Leslie Ann and I had a meeting earlier today to kind of try and talk about how we might move this piece forward. This is a piece that the consultant, the technical consultant, at least this technical consultant, is a little has less of a scope or no scope, if I'm correct on. And so, well, Jay or Leslie Ann, do you want to share what we had talked about? Or I'm happy to, but I feel like people are probably sick of hearing me talk.
Happy to jump in, and Jay, if you wanted to jump in as well. I think one of the things that we had talked about was to try and create a framework of the various pieces that would be brought together in terms of not just the climate data information projections moving forward, the things that we're planning for, and to sort of tee that up as to where it could possibly best fit in the climate action plan. And then as we start filling in those pieces, to bring that to bear in a couple of months' time. Jay?
Yeah, and I think our focus was, there's a lot of work that's happening with the Vermont climate assessment that's more backward looking. And we really focused a lot on the forward-looking climate modeling component and how Liz Leanne and myself and our expertise in weather and climate respectively could at least develop the framework for that come the middle of the summer and what that looks like. And also trying to just fit the pieces of some of the existing knowledge and work that we're doing in that area.
And there are also a number of additional moving pieces coming down the pike in terms of climate normals and climate projections that would be brought to bear on a really local level. And so having time and space to put that into what it best looks like would be great.
Right. So, and thank you both. And if I were to summarize, so what, excuse me, what I, the takeaway I think is there's two moving pieces. There's the kind of the backward looking what has happened to the climate, and that is to a large part where the climate assessment comes in. And I think separately we've reached out to have some folks potentially come in and provide a presentation to get us all on the same page on where the Vermont climate assessment is, and have that sometime in July. And then on the forward going piece, this is where Leslie Ann and Jay would take the lead in developing a framework where essentially a plan for what that might look like in the initial draft, in the initial climate action plan. Sorry, I'm not sure to call it initial or draft, so I used both. But the initial climate action plan. So, you know, climate assessment. Where are we now? What has happened in mid-July, and then a framework for how to present what may happen in the future, happening in mid-July with the actual, you know, actual path forward to come, you know, in the following months. Did I characterize that correct? I think I just tried to repeat what you guys said, so that, but in a different way so that people could hear it twice.
Yep, and I think TJ, just adding another layer to that would be trying to understand all of these risks from it, and not just the hazards themselves, but the impact component of it was something else we would try to step towards it. To that end, TJ and Jane possibly, I'm wondering who else perhaps from rural resilience might be on this. You know, and I'm thinking of the town level rural resilience risk assessment scale and how what that workflow could look like. I'm liaising with their committee, but it might make more sense for someone to be there too with us.
I'm happy to give some thought, or we can ask that on Friday, Jay, of that subcommittee.
Okay.
That might be a nice part of your update, yeah.
Great. So thank you both. I put you down as the task group leads on the climate data and modeling there. Next up is the human dimensions of climate change and health impacts.
I've been having some conversations with Jared Ulma and Dr. David Grass at Department of Health around some of the pieces that they're working on separately. And so I know they have a big project that's due this week. And as soon as that's out of the way, we'll be able to take a deeper dive into some of the things that might be able to form some sort of overlap with this subcommittee. So you can go ahead and put my name down there, TJ.
Liz-Ann, could you give a one-sentence summary of what these additional things are that you're talking about?
So they have a number of metrics that they're particularly interested in updating that my postdoc, Dr. Evan Oswald, had worked on about 8 years ago. And so we're just starting at the very beginning of what some of that update might look like. And there may be the potential to have some of that overlap into some of these pieces here around human health.
Okay.
And I'll note too that this came up, this particular line item was really of interest to the Just Transitions Committee when they were looking at our work plan. And you know, what's in our work plan has a few kind of health metrics, I should say, I guess, like air quality and looking at, you know, waterborne diseases and heat-related impacts, mental health, et cetera. And so, and, you know, recognizing that that's really just a subset of a few things that have been called out, but not necessarily the full scope of what might fall in this category. Bindu, you popped up on my screen. I can see you.
Yes. So Department of Health has been collecting a good data since 2009. It's called the Preface Database. And it's perhaps one of the statewide database that actually asks for race, gender, all of that, ability. I think all of these categories are already, included in that. And I know that they've been trying to include more of the climate and health variables. And there has been a lot of interest in especially looking into the increase in incidence of Lyme disease and kind of also dimensions of other infectious diseases as well. And, I'm definitely interested in this topic because of my background in environmental health, but I'm not sure to what extent I can actually help in it, but might be able to help with the review or so.
Great, thank you. I think we'll have Leslie Ann, if it sounded like if you need to call on Bindu in certain instances, I think that may be available as a resource. She may be available as a resource.
Absolutely.
Before I move on, is there anybody else that would like to volunteer to be on this group?
I might be able to be helpful depending on exactly what the scope of work is. Feel free to call on me. For those that don't remember, I'm also an epidemiologist, and I'm familiar with the BRFSS and what it does, what it can do. I've not yet succeeded in connecting with Jared Ulmer, and now that I know that he's working against a deadline, it makes me more sympathetic to the fact that he hasn't returned my calls. I do want to, I'm just going to say this once, and not because I want to start a long discussion, but we do need to pay attention to the impacts on Vermont of climate change effects elsewhere. And I'm particularly thinking about coastal flooding in New Jersey and then New England, that the impacts of population movements due to coastal flooding are not going to spare Vermont.
Thank you, Richard. Bindu, is that a old hand or is that a new one?
Sorry, it's an old one, yeah.
Okay. Jared, go ahead.
I was just going to note, I mean, I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning, and it may be obvious, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about this. I'll note from working on the cross-sector mitigation committee, if we're going to follow that kind of model of task leads to break out part of this work plan, one of the things that they've done is recognize that there's oftentimes folks with experience or expertise that can be helpful to those groups who may not be, regular members of the subcommittee. So like the transportation mitigation, emissions mitigation team has pulled in others, as has the the other one. So this may be an area where what we're identifying now is the kind of leads or co-leads from this committee, which I think is especially helpful for Jane and the EFG and Cadmus teams in terms of points of contact. But we should probably also keep in mind, as I think we have been, that when and where there are other sets of expertise or contacts that we might want to pull in on a specific task, that seems to be very appropriate and valuable, even if they're not kind of attending every subcommittee meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Jared, for making that point.
And I totally agree with that, Jared, because that's the way that Dr. Heidi Hales in the Climate and Air Quality Division and Jared Ulma and David Grast and I had worked a few years ago. So that's a sort of framework of thinking of bringing all these various dimensions of air quality, water quality, other parts of health into play. So definitely agree with that.
Okay, we're getting there, everybody. So social cost of carbon. This is something that I'm interested in, so I'll volunteer to be in this team. I have looked at these marginal abatement curves and damages costs a bit in the past, just to figure out what to apply for energy programs, and so I am interested in this. Oops.
And TJ, I just put in the chat likewise, and I don't know if Ken Jones, the economic research analyst from Agency of Commerce, is joining us today, but I know he's done a lot of this research as well, and would be a great resource if he's available.
All right, Ken, if you're there, I'm putting your name in parentheses here. And then the last one, I'm actually not sure whether we should have task leads on this. We probably should, although I think it's incumbent on each of these other topic areas to identify data gaps and make recommendations on whether and how to fill them. To the extent that we need task leads here, I think it would be, developing a monitoring and assessment strategy, or as Bindu mentioned earlier, analyzing like a platform and how that might, a software platform, and how that might work.
Yeah, I might suggest breaking that into two. Have the data gap, because I think the monitoring and assessment strategy is something that needs work now. So that we're prepared to be able to track progress as we move into implementation almost immediately. But agree, I'm not sure there's a lead on identification of data gaps. That's sort of collective work. I do think that agency needs an active role in the monitoring and assessment strategy. I'm not necessarily in a position to lead, so maybe you can put my name in parentheses, and we'll hope some other folks volunteer to help with that one too.
I don't know that I'm in a position to lead this one either, but we are at the Department of Public Service working on, improving data collection, as I think, Jared, I think you talked about this last time, and so I won't repeat it, but I could put myself in parentheses also, without committing to be the lead here, but I should say it probably would be helpful if there was somebody outside of state government here on this committee as well, or on this group.
TJ, go ahead and put me down for that committee. And I'm also going to offer up John Adams in his role at VCGI and some of those, or sort of platform-based things that he may be able to bring to the table in the way in which data could be served in and then ported out from a portal perspective. And how do you think about that from a larger overarching way of thinking about our data needs and collecting those data?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Leslie. And most of the content in this area in the Word document is from John, actually. So
I'd also note that similar to Julie and TJ, I'm happy to be in parentheses, but what that mainly means, I don't know if our dashboard and data manager, May Butler, is on the call right now, but this is really aligned with a lot of the work that she's doing, both on our energy dashboard and on the pathways work. So can either put May, I'll check in with May if she's not on the call, but can either put her name or me in parentheses, and then I'll check with her.
okay. Okay. Great. Okay. So going forward, I think what would be great for the well, for the next meeting, kind of really for each task group to kind of go back to the work plan and think about if it's not already there, what questions or what tasks or what questions would be helpful for the consultant to answer, and you know, where on this work plan would you put timing of things. And so there was a first attempt here to try and translate the Word document, like I said, but really critically looking at the subcommittee meetings, and this can really plan out and set up kind of our path forward on when we are able to deliberate and decide things. And I say that understanding that not everybody, you know, is probably aware of the timing of these activities in the scope of work for CADMIS and the technical, or well, NEFG, and so that part of that might be a little challenging in terms of the timing. The questions may be a little bit easier.
TJ, I can share the final contract with the subcommittee, which has the work line laid out in phases.
Great, thank you, Jane.
I'd also just offer that really thank you to, I assume it was Catherine, but correct me, whoever translated this work plan into this format. It's really helpful. Especially to see it laid out this way. I would say that I think, I guess I have a question about the pieces that are in the final contract around the economic and health modeling that around the emissions reduction pathways and strategies. I'm assuming that review of those initial, that initial analysis would be under the LEAP modeling task, TJ, since it's all kind of bound up together. Is that right, or does that need to be called out separately in terms of the, you know, review of assumptions and drafts of the economic analysis and the other pieces that we're kind of building on top of the LEAP modeling exercise?
So I'm going to apologize that I was distracted by trying to unshare my screen and I didn't hear the beginning of the question, and I still haven't succeeded.
So I'm just wondering if, I know we've spoken previously in that other work plan draft, we had made sure to identify the extent to which there is going to be analysis about some of the economic modeling and some of the health modeling that builds on top of the LEAP modeling. Right. Having some input on the assumptions and the review of initial drafts. Is your sense that in this work plan that's all bound up in that LEAP modeling task, and it's, you know, it's not just the emissions reduction pathways, but it's also the kind of concurrent or additive economic and health analysis that's built into the contract?
That's a good question. I think that in the spreadsheet that was just up, it was shorthand and it had leap modeling. In the work plan, I think it's a little broader and has kind of two parts: the leap modeling and that economic analysis. So I would say it's that's the work group, and I'm not going to pull it back up, but I'll add kind of that leap modeling, economic modeling assumptions.
Perfect. And then in response to Ken's comment in the chat, I don't know if he's available to unmute, but since he said that that's what he's interested in, be great. And we can put his name there with the leap modeling and economic analysis and not on the social cost of carbon, given his request in the chat.
Okay, great. I will do that.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I think hopefully this will have our path forward. Before we move on to the next agenda item, I'd just like to, each task group will need to meet and kind of look at this, try to set up timing. Do folks think we should come back in 1 week's time and try and have a short meeting where we nail things down and talk about this one more time? Or we looking at 2 weeks out to give time to actually do that, focus on it, and move forward with some of these pieces?
At this point, I prefer more frequent, shorter meetings. But I have to say that I'm not available next Wednesday.
So I do think there's going to become a time where we're going to need to meet every week. I'm not sure if next week is the time. So since there was a lot of silence, I'm going to propose that we come back in 2 weeks, that the task groups think about their tasks, and to the extent that you feel you need to engage with a consultant to talk about those, I think we'll go through Jane for now. Is that, I'm brainstorming off the top of my head. Okay, I do see you nodding. So, and then we'll plan to be back in 2 weeks to move pieces forward. And to the extent you have proposed agenda items, suggest those to Jared and myself.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking out loud here, but I can also imagine a scenario in which it may be helpful to have, at least for the foreseeable, couple of next month or two, I don't know. I mean, I think that our meeting schedule, of course, should be in service of the work plan and in coordination, especially to the degree there's overlap with our consulting team. But it may be helpful to do like an every other, where we're doing the full committee meetings every other week, and then the task groups have more time to, because there's some really substantive stuff that we're all going to need some time to really dig in on and focus on. And I think that's harder to do if we're meeting as a full committee every week, at least for the next bit of time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jared. I tend to agree with that. And every week we also end up spending 30 minutes on just updates and some administrative stuff, and it makes the every week less productive as well. Okay, so we'll plan on 2 weeks. We'll continue to revisit it. If we have enough agenda items, maybe we do go weekly. But otherwise we'll plan on 2 weeks.
And maybe that held time is helpful for some of the task groups where there's not overlap. So
yeah, agreed. Jane, don't take those meetings off our calendar every other week until the day of.
I cannot do that because there are a lot of people who join your meetings if I don't get them off the calendar and the library page sooner rather than later.
Oh, right.
But
Okay.
good idea.
All right. Okay, I want to transition. We're only 5 minutes behind, and I believe Taylor has joined us. Taylor Binnington from the Stockholm Energy Institute. and has been doing a lot of work for the department and A&R on the LEAP modeling that we talk about so lovingly, and the business as usual reference case that is now ready to share. So I'm going to go ahead to just turn it right over to you, Taylor, and let you introduce yourself more fully and take it away.
Sure. I'm off mute and hopefully you can see my screen.
We can see your screen, yeah, thank you.
How is that for smoothly transitioning to both enabling my microphone and my screen at the same time? So my name is, thanks TJ, by the way, and hello everybody. My name is Taylor Binnington, and I actually, just from looking at some of your names and videos on the call, I think a lot of us, I've interacted with many of you in the past. So I'm a scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, also answer to Stockholm Energy Institute, I guess, but we'll take those.
I apologize for that, Taylor. I got it right up until today.
It's okay. There's too many acronyms, too many things that start with E. So I don't blame you. So I've been working together with my colleague Jason Vasey, who is the deputy director of our energy modeling program at SEI, and together with TSD, we, as well as NESCOM, we've been working to develop an energy and emissions model to do sort of energy and emissions forecasting, and ultimately, develop low emissions mitigation pathways for the state of Vermont. So I'm pretty sure that everyone is at least passingly familiar, or possibly very familiar with the sort of process that we've undertaken in order to get here. So I won't dwell very long on that, but just to say that the purpose of sort of today's presentation is to talk about what our reference case or business as usual energy and emissions forecast looks like for the state, given all of the different data sources that we've managed to sort of assimilate to date. So, and I'll also mention this presentation. I was kind of trimming it down and culling a couple of slides, as recently as this morning. So this presentation, I understand it's to be made available publicly, and so TJ, I will share this with you just immediately following this call, and then you can put it on any venues that you need to do. So I detected just from hearing some of the conversation that I was eavesdropping on for the last 5 minutes or so, I joined a few minutes ago, that many participants on this call are sort of familiar with our role and with LEAP's role in the development of these mitigation pathways. So I won't say very much about LEAP other than to say that number one, it stands for Low Emissions Analysis Platform, and it's a piece of software that we develop at SEI, based in our Massachusetts office, which is the sort of headquarters of our U.S. center. And LEAP is an energy and emissions accounting tool that's particularly adept at developing sort of long-term scenarios and representations of like how energy systems change broadly over time. So it enables you to sort of zoom out and view an integrated picture of the whole energy system, and how the production and consumption of energy gives rise to different emissions. It has some sort of limited ability as well for including non-energy emissions, which I'll show you sort of towards the end of this presentation. And there are a couple of other sort of add-ons that we sort of may or may not see as part of this effort in Vermont, but we're actively working to develop LEAP and to develop its capabilities to include an ability to model things like health impacts, to come up with estimates for some of the SDGs or sustainable indicators towards sustainable development goals. And it can also be used to estimate the costs and benefits of different types of mitigation action, or of different scenarios compared to others. So it's really widely used. LEAP is really used all over the world in pretty much most countries. So for the so we've implemented LEAP for the sort of state of Vermont, covering a time period of 2015 to 2050. The first 4 of those years are so-called sort of our historical representation of energy flows over the last 4 years, and then our scenarios start all sort of starting in the year 2020. And the model covers all sort of sources of energy demand, ultimately energy supply within the state, as well as within and we will be including a representation of energy supply, of electricity supply across the whole ISO New England region, the whole electricity grid. And it covers, all of the associated GHG emissions and later other air pollutants and criteria of pollutants that come from those activities in Vermont. And we're including, as well, a simplified representation of non-energy emissions, which we'll see in a bit. And LEAP lets us display that in CO2 equivalent. We can adjust which global warming potential we want to use, or which of the IPCC assessment reports we want to derive those global warming potentials from sort of on the fly. We can differentiate even among scenarios, but we've chosen the 100-year GWP based on the 4th assessment report for the presentation of emissions, which you'll see today. And that's because those are the same choices made by the, or in the state's GHG inventory. So this slide just captures kind of where we are in this process, in our engagement with the state. And I've broken this down along, I guess, a couple of sort of dimensions of different sort of work tasks, and used green to kind of indicate the parts of the model development process that we've completed, and red are the things that are on the horizon, basically. So those 5 dimensions of work tasks essentially are to develop scenarios, to develop, to build out the scope of the model, its representation of different sectors, to include within that scope all of the different energy related emissions, and then later the different non-energy related emissions. And then sort of as an additional layer on top of all of these inputs, to include information about costs. And that will let us, or give us an ability to compare our scenarios on the basis of costs when we start developing, mitigation scenarios or combined mitigation pathways. So we've gotten to develop a reference case projection under the scenarios header. That's going to give way to developing mitigation scenarios. Right now, the model scope covers all sources of final energy demand, and sort of a simple representation of energy supply processes. And we'll see a little bit more what I mean by that later on. But where we're going with that is to develop sort of a more complete representation of how electricity is produced in the whole New England region. We've included GHGs so far, all the major greenhouse gases, but we will also be as sort of additional dimensions on this work, including other air pollutants, criteria pollutants, ultimately, and also including greenhouse gases that arise from non-energy emission sectors, being agriculture, waste, industrial products, land use and land use change, forestry, that kind of thing. So I want to say 2 things. That after this slide, I'm basically going to just dive into sort of providing one slide that I'm going to move sector by sector, and I'm going to provide sort of one slide that talks about just what is included in our representation of that sector, and then move from that slide to sort of showing some of the high-level results. Those results, the results might be a little bit dry, but we wanted to be sort of very systematic in our presentation of energy consumption, of energy use, emissions, sort of moving across all of the different sectors one at a time. And then at the end of this presentation, I'll get to a graph that shows total emissions across the state. So in terms of like questions, because I saw there was a little chat flashing here. I haven't actually seen what the text of that chat is, but maybe what I'll do is I will sort of reserve maybe your questions for sort of when I go through sort of the main sources of what's in each sector. And then again, kind of once I've presented a series of different results for that sector. So sort of 2 opportunities per sector, and that way we can move a little bit more expediently through this. So I hope that's okay. But maybe before I dive into those sectors, I'll just pause for 1 minute and ask if there's anything right off the top that anyone would like to ask, just concerning sort of the timeline or the structure of this sort of modeling effort. Sounds good? Okay. So I'm going to dive right into the on-road transportation sector. So these are, again, I mentioned this is sort of an abbreviated version of some slides that we've presented earlier, and I really just focused not so much on how LEAP performs its calculations, but just what are the major sources of data, and then I'll kind of explain a little bit about how we assimilate those into in this case a model of the on-road transport sector. So what I'll say just off the top is that our modeling of on-road transport is developed based on sort of an accounting of all of the different vehicles of each vehicle class or vehicle technology that are sort of currently on the road or will be on the road in Vermont. And each one of those is assigned a distance that it travels each year and a fuel economy that gives us an estimate of the total energy that is consumed, and then we can assign emissions to the consumption of that energy, and that gives us our emissions forecast. So we've built the transport model using a sort of a complete database of vehicle registrations from Vermont's DMV, and that gave us a sort of a slice of what is currently on the road as it happens in the year 2019. And we've sort of fleshed that out and filled it out a little bit with some historical vehicle registrations from University of Vermont's Transportation Research Center and the Federal Highway Administration. And that gives us kind of a complete representation of, for the last couple of years, what all of the different vehicles are of different vehicle technologies and weight classes all across the state. We've incorporated information about both historical as well as forecasted VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, all the way through the year 2040 that align with UVM's own modeling that forecasts VMT across the sort of fleet of vehicles. And then we've taken some of the energy consumption characteristics of each one of these vehicles, being their fuel economy and the mileage that we might expect them to travel each year, from another source. Actually, it's a model that is developed by Argonne called Vision 2020. And that includes all kinds of sort of useful information that is sort of derived from vehicle surveys, as well as the Federal Highway Administration, that describe how vehicles' sort of energy consuming characteristics might change over time. That also includes information about the ethanol blends in gasoline, biodiesel blends in diesel, etc. We have included estimated electric vehicle sales that Velco uses for light duty vehicles in its IRP. And then for the non-light duty vehicle classes, we've taken electric vehicle technologies from the multi-state MOU that was signed. I'm afraid I couldn't name all the states that have signed that, but that gives us an estimate of actually not just electric vehicles, but of so-called zero emission vehicles in those two weight classes. And then other vehicle sales are, we derived, or we borrow the vehicle sales forecasts that are embedded within Vision 2020, and those are actually aligned with the US Energy Information Administration's Annual Energy Outlook, or AEO 2020. And then finally, we calculate emissions based on EPA's state inventory tool, which uses a method that is basically the same, but not quite, as was used for the Vermont GHG inventory. And we've pulled a couple of additional emission factors from REIT, which is another transport model, provides a convenient set of emission factors for fuels like, compressed natural gas, that kind of thing. So quick pause for questions just on the what's included in.
Yes, I have a question for you. This is
Sure.
Richard Hopkins.
Hi, Richard.
I know this is an elaboration of a fairly standard method, but why not just use the sales of diesel and gasoline in Vermont, which are available?
For the historical period of time. Well, so what we want to do is, you're talking about sales of gallons of gasoline and diesel from the Joint Fiscal Office, I guess. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, we know how much tax is collected, so we know how much is sold for the state as a whole annually. And it covers off-road as well as on-road to some degree. So it's a little, so that it wouldn't be strictly on-road, but why not use directly the number of gallons of fuel burned?
Well, that's, I'll try to answer this sort of briefly. I mean, that's what we would want to do is make sure that when we construct this sort of this method, when we implement this method to develop these scenarios, that over the past couple of years, that our estimates of energy consumption of liters or gallons of diesel and gasoline align with what we know to have been sold. That's true. But just that information alone doesn't really tell us anything about the structure of the sector that consumes that energy. So what we want to do is to develop a framework that allows us to go in and manipulate levers and knobs to increase the sales of different vehicle technologies, to watch how the stock of vehicles changes over time, and then a result that we get out of that is the forecasted energy consumption for gasoline, diesel, for other fuels too, but just in a way that is benchmarked to that historical data that you just cited.
Okay, thanks. I won't hold you up any further.
Okay, let me jump into some results.
If it's okay, Taylor, I have a quick question, which if it's a longer answer than just one word, I'm happy to connect offline, but I am curious, given I just posted a link in the chat. First of all, thank you for this presentation. This is just great, such important work, really helpful to see. One of the things that we have noticed and worked to try to get clarity and alignment on is the different definitions around light versus medium versus heavy duty that are used across DOE, FHWA, EPA. And so I'm curious what definitions you used here, because they end up, they're very different, which can be surprising to folks. And maybe we can get into the details offline, but if there's a short answer in terms of which set of characteristics and definitions you used for the vehicle fleet, that would be helpful.
Yeah, there are a bunch. It's kind of inconvenient. Light duty is class 1 and 2, medium duty is classes 3 through 6, gross weight classes, and heavy duty is 7 and 8. That's the very short answer to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Taylor, there's also a question in the chat here on how does the LEAP approach to the transport sector compare to the MOVES model? And just, is it as detailed or less detailed, more detailed?
Good question. It is less detailed. Moves has a lot of, so first of all, it has a much more sort of fine-grained representation of different vehicle technologies than we have in this model. I've never personally used Moves, so I hope I don't misstate anything, but I think it also includes information about, like average vehicle speeds and sort of when they like running cold versus running hot emissions, that kind of thing. We don't have that level of detail in this, but what we do have is sort of a representation of each of the vehicles that's on the road and how old they are and when we expect them to retire, and then an assumption for what vehicle sales will be of different technologies. So, each vehicle comes with a certain number of VNT, which comes with a certain annual consumption of whatever fuel it consumes, which comes with an estimate of emissions in each year. And that's really how this model, what drives this model. And I will thank you for flagging something in the chat, TJ. I don't have the bandwidth to sort of monitor the chat too, so I'll count on you or others to sort of do that.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
Cool. Let me jump into some results here. So what we have here is these are passenger car sales, so sort of gross weight vehicle class 1, shown by each of the different vehicle technologies. And here you can see sort of what I mean by a vehicle technology in this model. So these are the shares of all of the sales in each year for each one of these vehicle classes. And you can see even in the reference case here, we've got kind of a significant move away from gasoline vehicles, which is sort of the brown color, towards the electrified technologies. EV A, B, and C, I really should have updated this legend, but those represent electric vehicles, all electric vehicles that have ranges of up to 100, 200, and 300 miles, respectively, on a single charge. So we see, primarily it's the longer range and the intermediate range EVs that kind of dominate the market for passenger cars in the future. And this is just aligned with, assumptions that Velco has also used from their so-called sort of medium forecast for light-duty EV sales in Vermont. If we look at the same kind of graph for light trucks, also, a move towards electrification, not quite as significantly, but with the sort of middle distance as well as plug-in hybrids playing a little bit more of a role, but still, gasoline-powered trucks sort of being gradually or slowly phased out. And when we add those two sort of assumptions for sales together, really, what emerges is our estimate for the total number of light-duty vehicles, both cars and trucks, that are on the road in each year. So those sales assumptions drive the, I just keep using the word drive, I can't help it, drive the assumption or the estimate of the number of vehicles on the road in each year. And here you can see, again, a shift towards vehicle electrification, but that's a little bit slower because of just the existing inertia, I guess, of fossil fuel powered vehicles that's in the existing fleet. But where we start to see some fairly different results is when we look at energy demand and then ultimately emissions for on-road transport. So what we have here is energy demand for all the different vehicle classes, which is declining quite a bit. And the major reason for that, again, is just those electrification trends that you saw. So electricity is embedded inside this energy demand, but just on a joule for joule basis, electricity is sort of a more efficient way of moving people around, and so we see energy demand drop. And that translates, as you might expect, to, here's the same chart, but shown by fuel instead of by vehicle class. So this is across all vehicle classes. You can see that little sliver of electricity coming in. And then these charts translate into on-road transportation emissions, which are sort of what you might expect them to be. You know, they're reduced with, you know, along the reduction in energy demand. Okay, I just have 2 slides just to very quickly highlight what we've done outside of the road transport sector. You know, not all transport is on the road. It includes you know, boats, planes, rail as well. And we have included an estimate of the energy consumption in these different sectors and their emissions. It's really kind of, it's quite a bit simpler than what we've done in the on-road sector, just because this is not a major source of emissions or of energy consumption. So the sort of historical and forecasted fuel shares across these sectors, we've borrowed from the annual energy outlook, and assumed that the sort of total energy consumption per capita, so per Vermont resident, just remains the same as it always was. And we can derive that number based on you know, what we know historical population and energy consumption in these sectors to have been. And then we apply emission factors to that. And what we get is a you know, not a very exciting chart that just shows energy, that shows greenhouse gas emissions outside of the road transport sector, pretty much flat in this sector. Okay, let me pause again for any questions on either the road or non-road transport results that I've shown.
So in the chat, Taylor, there's some conversation, okay. Just you know, confirming that you know the difference between out-of-staters purchasing fuel that might show up in the you know the just actual fuel consumption from sales of fuel and the actual emissions, and how that, or in what's in the model here, and how that lines up or doesn't. I don't know if you could speak to that. Yeah, so actually one of the there is a slight difference in the on-road transport sector and in our sort of representation of energy consumption and what you would see in the inventory. I'll get to the question of out-of-state consumers in just a moment, but I know that the greenhouse gas inventory, I'm kind of speaking directly to you here, Colin, because I know you're on the phone, uses you know, sales of gasoline from the JFO in place of an alternative data source, which we've used in this model, which comes from the EIA, from the State Energy Data System, or SEDS. Those 2 estimates, I mean, you know, one is kind of a national scale estimate using consistent methodology for the gasoline that may be consumed in Vermont, and another is, you know, is more granular and correct local data. We have not necessarily used those. We have not used those. The numbers are close, but they're not exact. And so I don't know, I guess in either of those cases, the consumption of gasoline, at least in well, actually, maybe somebody else could could chime in and provide this as a piece of input to me, because I don't know whether the JFO monitors consumption of gasoline in state or just pump sales. I suspect it's the latter, regardless of where that gasoline is consumed. That's my understanding of it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And you know, I guess I just also want to just remind folks that the model too is indicative to help us understand the impacts of pathways. I think you know, the transportation sector is within, you can tell me how far off the emissions are in the historical, but they're pretty close, like, you know, less than, and in all the sectors, it's probably, you know, plus or minus 2 to 3%, you know, from the emissions, what's shown in the model versus what's shown in the climate inventory for historical data. And generally, as long as things appear to be moving in the right direction, a 2 to 3% change, difference from that historical starting point is usable in how we think about these long-term indicative changes, right? We don't really even know how many sales of electric vehicles there will be in 2030. We're projecting that based on best reasonable assumptions that we have. But so I just wanted to throw out, and Taylor can even attest to this, because I have looked at the results previously and get stuck on really small things that make a really tiny difference in the results. And we just have to remember that there's the tool is really useful for seeing these general long range impacts, but you have to get to a level of where you're saying, okay, this is precise enough for our purposes. And so I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah. This question of like, where do Vermonters sort of buy their fuel? It's a little bit like, the question of consumption versus production-based electricity emissions accounting, kind of, but except the effect is much smaller in transport. Anyways, and TJ, you're absolutely right. In terms of like how our GHG emissions align with the state's inventory in the 3 years that they overlap, in 2015, 16, and 17, across like for transportation, they are almost correct. They, depending on the year, they range within about 2% to sort of 5% error compared to the inventory. And in the other sectors, industry, residential, commercial, they're extremely close, so, less than 1% or so off, about a percentage off. Yeah.
Just before you leave this, it's Richard again. Other category for non-road, I can think of several categories that might be in there: agricultural uses, construction equipment, off-road vehicles, snowmobiles, boats, recreational boats. Are some or all of those included in the other category?
So I believe recreational boats, like boats of all types, are included under navigation. You've listed a number of them in snowmobiles. You mentioned another thing that tends to get grouped under other is energy use for pipeline transport. Just as an FYI, kind of consumption for agricultural tractors. Yeah, I'm afraid I can't remember off the top of my head whether that's lumped under this category or whether that reappears in a different sector. I do want to say that energy consumption we're accounting for, I don't remember whether it's under this pink category or somewhere else though.
Okay, and then we have non-road construction type equipment as well.
Yeah, that energy consumption would be found under a sector that I'll show you kind of very briefly at the end under sort of industry, which includes manufacturing and construction. And the construction includes, construction related vehicles and equipment.
But here in Addison County, where I live, we have a couple of big quarries that are full of machines that run all day long, moving rock around. I guess I don't dispute that at all. I want to just sort of, for the sake of assuring you, say that the energy consumption that is associated with those vehicles sort of moving rock around is, we rely on this model on sort of external data sources to sort of capture that fuel consumption in the data sources that we calibrate our model to. So in the case of the industrial sector, which I'll get to later on, that diesel consumption primarily, we rely on the Energy Information Agency being able to collect that data, and then we represent it under the industrial sector. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you.
Taylor, this is David Hill. Just really briefly, thank you. And I'm glad to see the level of granularity, like on the fleet, the fleet composition over time and the changes in sales. That'll be really, really helpful. in the BAU, what level of, say, federal improvements in efficiency standards or things that are driving the different, I just assume that we'll need to make sure we document what's in the BAU at the policy level that's driving some changes in the sales and the vehicle fleet composition.
Yeah, that's a really good point, David. I know that so the fuel economies for the different road transport technologies that we're representing in those models, those fuel economies include, on the books federal policy, things like CAFE standards, and that's something that's actually kind of already embedded in this external model that we've relied a fair bit on for the construction of the road transport sector, Vision 2020. So we haven't sort of explicitly put that in ourselves because we know that would be double counting it, but it's embedded in those inputs. But I take your point about the need to document, everything we do, and maybe this is a good opportunity just to say that the model itself, the file that you open on your laptop that is this model that runs in this software called Leap, includes within it sort of a pretty comprehensive way of documenting assumptions and sources of data, that is attached to each one of the inputs, each one of the data inputs. So we're documenting everything, within the model itself. That kind of makes it very portable. I had better move on to the next sector, I think.
Yeah, so 15 to 20 more minutes, Taylor, so.
Okay. Okie dokie. Let me jump into commercial buildings. In broad strokes, we have represented sort of commercial and institutional buildings using some relatively old now survey data from the Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, or EIA's CBECS. That lets us kind of break commercial energy consumption into a handful of different commercial building types, kind of with and without retrofit, roughly by vintage, whether they were built before or after the year 2007. And it gives us information about that is correct kind of on a regional basis for the penetration of different building energy technologies and the amount of energy consumption of different fuels per square foot of commercial space that get used. And then we've projected the total number, or the total amount of commercial floor space based on a commercial floor space projection that we find then in the AEO. And then we've tweaked that, that's like the frame, I guess, of the model for the commercial sector. And then we've gone in and made adjustments to account for state-specific data that include adjustments to the shares of different technologies that are used for space heating, for lighting and water heating, and that comes from a recent commercial market, a market assessment survey for the commercial sector that Cadmus conducted. We've also included a pre-existing forecast for the expected number of heat pumps that get introduced into the commercial sector, which we have assumed displace thermal fuels. We've made some tweaks as well to account for planned energy efficiency under energy efficiency programs for thermal fuels, for gas, for electricity. And those come from Efficiency Vermont, or a recent order by Vermont PUC that has some estimates for expected levels of natural gas efficiency. And then again, we've made sure that when we calculate our greenhouse gas emissions based on this energy consumption, that we've done so in a way that's compatible with the existing state's GHG inventory. So we've used the state inventory for emission factors. I'm not going to pause after this slide. I'll get to the end of the commercial sector and then I'll ask for some questions. So just very quickly, I want to show sort of what this looks like in terms of the composition of the building fleet for commercial buildings using the four main types of building categories that we're using in this model. So we've grouped any building that is totally unretrofitted and that was built before the year 2007 into one sort of average category with average characteristics. And then we've broken out those old buildings by whether or not they've undergone either a heating or a ventilation, an AC retrofit, or some sort of a weatherization improvement. And that's the green and brown categories here. And then buildings that were built after that year, sort of to a more modern standard, or old buildings that received both an HVAC retrofit and an insulation retrofit, they comprise this blue category. So this chart just shows you that our assumptions really for the total amount of commercial square footage divided among these different categories here. So something to sort of keep in mind as we look at the next few slides, because each one of these building categories has with it a different, different heat requirements because of the leakiness of the building shell. It has a different average mixture of technologies that it uses for heating and cooling and water heating. And all of those effects are captured sort of in our estimate of total fuel consumption and total emissions. So what we get, it ends up being, it's not particularly interesting actually. And so this is, or it doesn't change substantially is what I really mean by that. So this just shows commercial energy consumption by different end uses across all of those building types. Obviously the big ones being space heating, but also also like water heating, miscellaneous energy usage, which depends on the particular type of commercial subsector or institutional subsector. And really that these numbers don't change that much is due to a little bit of some efficiency improvements as we migrate to a stock of buildings that is on average newer. Those are on average a little bit more efficient, and so that sort of increase in our assumption for commercial floor space kind of gets canceled out by that effect, and we see flat-ish energy demand here. If we look at the same chart, but by fuel, again, we have kind of declining fuel oil consumption, but it's, just visually based on this chart, there are not really too many structural changes that are going on here. And part of the reason, despite the fact that we have included a lot of assumptions that were provided to us based on the planned savings from an efficiency program, for example, or the number of heat pumps that Velco has also assumed that would be deployed in the commercial sector. As it happens, there's just not that many of those in the commercial sector, just based on those assumptions. And so what you see here is kind of largely the effect of assuming that things don't change very much. And that sort of comprises the spirit of this business as usual or reference type scenario here. If I drill in a little bit more to space heating specifically, this is space heating across all of the commercial buildings. We see, a more dramatic phase out of fuel oil until it actually totally disappears. And it's, and that sort of reduces total energy consumption, but part of that is shifted towards wood, part of it is shifted towards natural gas. You can see electricity in the commercial building sector plays a very small part. And this is, I think this is kind of a something that we would, we'd welcome some input on. This just comes as a result of the relatively small number of heat pumps that get deployed in commercial buildings as opposed to residential buildings. And we'll see that in a few slides. We just wanted to sort of represent Velco's heat pump forecast in its purely, I guess, without layering any additional assumptions on top of that. And if we look at, these are emissions, GHG emissions by fuel, and then by end use. Same chart, but by end use. So LEAP is convenient in that it lets us kind of slice and dice these different results along a number of different dimensions. We can show, relatively quickly, a lot of these different results displayed by a dimension of our choosing. Okay, let me pause here for any questions on the commercial sector.
This is Julie Moore. I have a question. Just looking at this chart as I sit in my office today, the very small bar that's attributed to space cooling is like air conditioning part of space heating, and cooling is actually refrigeration, or?
No, it's actually, air conditioning is in there. It's just that, and this continues to surprise me, and I know that it is sort of a surprising result, frankly, but especially as you get into, I mean, even in like the southern U.S., where space cooling is much more prolific, compared to the energy that it takes to heat a home, it's just very small. It's always surprisingly small. But the thin wedge of space cooling you see here is a result of that effect, the sort of just different amounts of energy that it takes to heat as opposed to cool. But it also comes from the fact that, everybody heats, not everybody cools. So the penetration of space cooling demand, per the share of commercial floor space is less than 100%, quite a bit less than 100% in this case. Yeah, it's a good observation. Any other questions? Shall we jump to residential buildings?
I have one. This is Ken. I noticed in the graph looking at the different fuels that heating oil, as you said, drops down to almost zero, but propane doesn't. And so what is that technology that suggests that fuel oil is going away and propane isn't?
Yeah, that's this comes mostly from just an assumption that we've made about as we introduce new technologies, which fuels they tend to displace. And this is sort of in part an assumption, but also driven by sort of data that it tends to be sort of oh no, I'm sorry, this is the commercial sector, so I can't make a rural versus urban argument. I could get you a much better answer than that. I'll just say for now that it really comes down to just an assumption that we've made, sort of going all the way to the end of the scenario for which fuels displace which ones when we migrate to them. But I can get you a better answer than that, Ben.
I had a related but different question, which is to what extent are biodiesel or renewable natural gas showing up as heating fuels in your reference case? I'm actually, I think it'll be more important in the kind of pathways in terms of different mitigation strategies, but I'm wondering if part of what may be happening here is that there's a known replacement for distillate fuel oil in biodiesel, where there is not really a low emissions, at least economical and at scale option for a propane replacement that is projected at any near-term time scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably gonna see, or it's likely that we will include some amount of bio heating oil, basically, in a mitigation scenario. I mean, personal opinions aside about which role it may play in sort of a low carbon future, but I wanted to say here that we actually, just because currently that amount is so small, that we have not represented it separately. So the distillate fuel oil you see here is, actually, I suppose it could contain small quantities of biodiesel, but that difference is at least invisible to us just based on the data sources that we've used. But certainly, you know, incorporating biodiesel as a displacement for heating oil, and then assuming different emissions for that fuel oil is something that we can do and will do for the mitigation scenarios. Okay. And I just made a note for myself. Ken, I'm going to drill into that question a little more, and I can route something through TJ as an answer.
Thank you.
Okay, let's jump into residential buildings. You know, I mean, residential sector is a huge consumer of energy. I mean, buildings generally are, and we've included, you know, considerable levels of detail in our modeling of the residential sector, because a lot of the different policies that we might want to represent or that we know are already on the books kind of require a certain level of granularity in order for us to be able to sort of correctly represent those trends that we want to include in our baseline here. I am, for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to just say all of the different data sources that we've included in the residential model. So I'll just sort of summarize it in a paragraph here. Like the commercial sector, it's the frame of the residential sector is kind of built upon EIA's residential energy consumption survey. And that lets us represent the consumption of energy in different categories of households, whether they are single family, attached versus detached, multifamily, so apartments of different number of average occupants, whether they are owned or rented, and then within each one of these we have a representation of different energy end uses and all of the different technologies that are used to meet those end uses. So the mixture of different heating technologies that provide space heat, the mixture of different water heating technologies that provide water heating, etc. And we've, again, that's the sort of frame of the residential sector. And then we've incorporated a large amount of Vermont specific historical data that adjust the information we would have seen in RECs. But we've also included a number of forecasting assumptions for how those, say, shares of different technologies within different types of households may change in the future based on all kinds of different sources, like the residential market assessment, efficiency programs from Efficiency Vermont, assumptions about the number of or the share of households that receive some sort of weatherization improvement, etc. And again, the number of heat pumps that we expect to be introduced, changes to average device efficiencies, even changes to heating and cooling degree days, actually. And this is something that we intend to implement buildings wide in the commercial sector too, but I just haven't quite gotten there yet. So that we'll be able to develop scenarios that explore different number of heating and cooling degree days and the effect on space heating and space cooling energy demand. So here's the different residential building categories that we have represented. The growth in this is driven just by population growth assumptions that we have embedded in the model. Those are aligned, I should say, with the transport modeling that is done at UVM. So we have some cross-model harmonization. But here's where we start to see much more interesting and kind of dramatic results. This is energy demand in residential buildings by end use. And across a lot of these charts, a significant thing that drives the change in the reduction in energy consumption and the corresponding reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the residential sector is tied to mostly actually to an assumption that Velco used in their IRP for the number of heat pumps which might be rolled out in households. And that just has it's a very large number, and it has an effect of displacing a lot of the thermal fuels that would otherwise have been used in households. And the result is that we see, steeply declining energy demand for space heating in households. I apologize for the brown and red being next to one another. Yeah. Here's similar chart, but by fuel. So you can see electricity is increasing. Obviously not enough to keep this chart flat, and that's just because when you use electricity to heat in a heat pump, you do so much more efficiently than you use oil or gas or propane to heat in a boiler or a furnace. Energy demand, just looking specifically at space heating, that's where the electrification is much more pronounced, just as a share of the energy used in that end use. And the corresponding reduction in direct greenhouse gas emissions by fuel and by end use, again, where most of that reduction is coming from space heating. Okay, based on what you said about 16 minutes ago, TJ, that I had 20 minutes left, does that give me 4 minutes?
I think that's about right, to get as far as you can, and then we want to be respectful of time and leave time for public comment here, where you may get another question or two.
Well, what I'm going to do, if it's okay, is I want to show a summary. Okay, I'm gonna. No, I guess I can't skip anything really. So I'm just going to go quickly show. We also have a representation of industrial energy consumption. This gets to the the construction vehicles in quarries that you were speaking of earlier, and I'll just show that energy demand and in that sector is sort of largely unchanged. These trends are based on the annual energy outlook. We don't have a lot of information for this sector in Vermont. I'm going to jump to the electric sector and just say very quickly, if you recall from before I started showing results, I kind of gave an overview of the timeline for this project. I spoke about a simple representation that we've included for that lets us estimate, grid-based emissions or CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity that's consumed in Vermont. We have just a really simple representation of that right now, based on an assumption that of the Vermont's renewable energy standard, pre-existing nuclear contracts, which we assume will expire in 2034. And then everything else just comes from the rest of the grid, sort of an average mixture that has embedded within it some average energy intensity. This is not exactly the same method that has been used for the GHG inventory. And so we generate some slightly different GHG results here. But I just, our results are kind of preliminary because we're going to be building a much more comprehensive and detailed and very bottom-up representation of how megawatts of electric generation capacity get used to produce megawatt hours of electricity wherever they are produced across the grid. And that's an ongoing area of work for us right now. So I want to land then on I wanted to give that caveat, I guess. And I want to land on this slide, which is, putting together all of the different emitting sectors in the so-called canonical energy sector. So that's transportation, industrial energy use, buildings. Those are the solid colors here. Layering on top of those the non-energy emissions that come from agriculture, waste, industrial processes, within which we've made some just very simple assumptions, sort of trend-based assumptions for how those might change in the future, just based on historical trends that we saw in those sectors. And if we stack all of this up, we can draw some lines. The solid black line on top being gross emissions all the way out to 2050. The dotted line, and then the green line beneath being a very simple assumption for land use change in forestry, or LULUCF. And then when we subtract that from the solid black line, that gives us the dotted line, which is a forecast for total net emissions. And I've just sort of superimposed the three major targets, the Global Warming Solutions Act targets in 2025, 2030, and 2050 over top of this here. So I'm sure this will generate some discussion, but I couldn't show this result without saying something very quickly about the electricity sector. So I'll stop there for questions.
Yeah, this is Ken. I put in the chat that this is the business as usual projection, and a couple of the results I think are surprising in that in the two specific ones that I look at are the EV penetration, which I've looked at what people are projecting to be national manufacturing rates of EVs, and it appears to be significantly greater than that, but also the heat pump. The fact that the heat pumps take over that significant a role as in a business as usual scenario is surprising, but also because this council is supposed to be developing strategies, if they kind of assume that that's what's going to happen automatically, really changes the tenor of the discussion. So I just, it's my observation that if that's how the world's going to go without us doing anything, that's really surprising.
Well, I mean, I think there's debate as what you use for assumptions, but I'll respond for the heat pump one, for example, and I put in the chat that there were more heat pumps installed in 2020 than what the forecast assumed. And that's with the current policies on the books, with the Efficiency Vermont support and the renewable energy standard support. And so it's this balance of, well, these policies are on the books. We would expect them to continue because utilities have continued requirements. Efficiency Vermont's not going away. And so, why wouldn't that happen? I think the transportation one, the EVs, the forecast, does the forecast need to be realigned, or is it not realistic? That's any of these forecast assumptions are open to that question, I guess. But I just, I think the goal of this business as usual forecast from a, modeling high level, policy modeling perspective is to say, what do we think is going to happen with what we have on the books now? And that makes our work harder in the Climate Council because we're already making a lot of progress. I think that's a good thing.
I guess though, in terms of the heat pumps, it's based on a Velco presumption, and I applaud Velco for being prepared for that future. But again, I am not sure that level of penetration is, I'll say, sustainable. And also, we really need to learn. While indeed we've installed a lot of heat pumps, the early results are showing that they're not giving the level of heat displacement, fossil fuel heat displacement, than was it earlier suggested. A lot of people are putting in heat pumps for the purpose of keeping their house cool in the summer.
Right. Yeah. Originally, people were saying that it was going to displace 80% of the heat load, which was ridiculous on its face, but those were the original assumptions. We found that it's 30 to 40% unless you're putting in a ducted system, which is different. But, and yeah, we continue to do evaluations and we're using the best data on those, and Velco is using the best data that was available at the time.
But I guess my main point is, if we think of this as business as usual, it's kind of a classical use of business as usual. That means we don't have to adopt any new policies in order to get us there. And
Yeah.
maybe that's the case, but I don't think, yeah, and Jared's shaking his head. I don't think that we should base our future work, the next few months worth of work, on that. Oh yeah, this is all going to happen if we don't do anything in addition to what
I
policies.
definitely invite you and others to look at the forecast of heat pumps and the assumptions. You know, it's the data that everybody in the state has been using. Do heat pumps leak
Right.
refrigerants and we're not counting for that? Yes. Those get picked up in the climate modeling, but that's a whole different issue. It's related, but I just, please
Okay.
look at the
Yeah,
assumptions.
I will.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question and then just offer a caveat. And I think, and I don't know if Lou is on here, and I agree that the Velco and Itron forecast is a really helpful reference point. We incorporated that into our EAN emissions reduction pathways modeling as well. But I think we all need to make sure that we have an appropriate degree of humility of what we know and what we can know and what is unknown. And the highest degree of confidence is what has happened in the past and what is happening currently. We also have a very high degree of confidence about you know, the relative scale and pace of sectoral pathways and technological change that will have to happen by 2025 and 2030 to meet these targets. But even when you have the best modeling, and I'm very confident in the team at SEI and others who are involved in this, the number of assumptions and variables that go into a business as usual reference case scenario, it is notoriously difficult to predict. And when you do any backcasting on efforts like this that have said 5-10 years out, you see very big, oftentimes, divergence between what was projected and what actually happened. And that's just the nature of trying to predict the future. And I just want to note that, like, a lot of the Velco numbers, they weren't saying, we think this is what's going to happen in the future because we know. They were saying, here's a low case scenario, here's a medium case scenario, here's a high case scenario, and we need to do all of those projections to figure out what that means for the grid and our planning efforts. So I want to make sure that we don't misuse projections as though they're predictions of the future. They're scenarios that help us understand what could happen. But and Lou or others can correct me if I'm wrong, Velco wasn't saying with a high degree of certainty, this is going to be the future in 2025 and 2030, just based on a glide path of business as usual. And I totally agree with Ken. If we think that these are reference cases, if this is a business as usual case that is expected to happen, we need to make sure there are policies and programs that give us a high degree of assurance that we'll actually hit these targets and not rely on just, you know, modeling assumptions that, you know, it's just impossible for anybody to know. We've got to be more certain about this in terms of making sure we'll get there and not just say, well, Velco had a scenario in which it showed a high level of EV and heat pump adoption, so we don't have to do anything. And I'm not saying that's what anybody's saying, and I know that's not what you're saying, TJ, but I just think we need to consistently remind ourselves about the limitations and the appropriate humility of modeling exercises.
Well, and I think Taylor showed that, you know, also the buildings become the building shells become, the majority of them are equivalent to a post-2007 performance level. So there are a lot of buildings that will still be around that don't have that type of shell performance unless we're doing upgrades to those shells. So to be able to track that and know what that path is an important outcome, whether that's business as usual or requiring new policies to get there remains to be determined, that you at least have the steps that would be required to get to that level of emissions reduction.
Yeah, maybe just, yeah, quickly, I'll just respond. I think, I mean, I think what you said, Jared, I think it's very well said, and just highlight as well another element of this, the work that we're doing, which we don't have a huge amount of sort of scope to do this, but we do want to include some kind of exploration. I mean, an actual, you know, scenario analysis, really, an exploration of scenarios around things that are uncertain. And some of those things that are uncertain are, you know, what's the climate doing? How many heating degree days are there? You know, what might our population forecast be? But it also, the things that really matter are, how quickly will people adopt EVs or cold climate heat pumps, that kind of thing. I mean, these are really like critical uncertainties in how humans will behave that we don't know. And so we want to, we want to include, well, in this effort, we do want to get into some of those questions at least. Don't have a huge amount of time to do it, but we want to show something.
Hi, this is Lou. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you, Lou.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I just want to echo Jared's comments. I think you characterized it well. And thank you, Taylor, for the presentation. Yeah, I mean, Velco is not, prescribing any particular future. And really, we worked with our partners to develop the forecasts that we used. The heat pumps came from Efficiency Vermont, and the electric vehicles came from Drive Electric Vermont. And so we use these as inputs to our plan. Not to say that it necessarily would happen, but to evaluate what was, potentially most likely to happen based on what we know today, based on the present economic adoption rates. And even since those forecasts have come out, we've seen huge shifts in the electric vehicle industry. And we're seeing heat pump adoption is increasing beyond that. So this is it's not static either. This is something that will be updated going forward and probably on a rolling basis. So what we have today is not necessarily what needs to remain. We can certainly update it for Velco's purposes, but then, for our own purposes, we don't have to take what is given as the word of law. So we can certainly, adjust these upwards or downwards based on understanding of what's actually happening.
Thanks. And so recognizing that it's after 4 now, I do want to just open the floor for public comment and on what you've seen on the LEAP modeling, or how we parsed out the work plan. And Taylor, I think you could probably at this point stop sharing your screen, I think. And thank you. I should say, I do see your hand, George, but thank you, Taylor. That was great. I don't know how you're going to do it in a half hour tomorrow, but we probably should talk about that. But thank you very much, and much appreciated.
Great. Yep. I'll find a way to trim it down. Thanks.
Thanks. And if you could just stick around in case there's questions for you from the public here as well. But George, go ahead.
Hi. First off, I was very intrigued by all these findings and the business as usual case. I was, like others, a little puzzled by some of the outcomes, but especially the biomass take rate. I guess one of the questions that I'm not familiar with the LEAP modeling capabilities in regards to forecasting future market take rates on different things. I'm assuming there's some assumptions that are tunable knobs. For that matter, pricing of things that would be like the price of EVs could be a major factor in people's decision, even though once you have one, the cost of operation is lower than a conventional car. So could Taylor take a moment to elaborate on its ability to do that, especially since some classes of the people who are of lesser means are going to be having a hard time to stretch their budgets to accommodate some of the things we're talking about. And that would impact the market take rate.
Yeah. So that, I mean, you're absolutely right that on everything you said about how people's purchasing decisions are affected and the sort of lifetime costs or savings of EVs. I want to say, on one hand, what we could do with sort of this model is to try to incorporate in it, some, it would be like, evidence-based information about how people tend to make purchasing decisions by including, some like an economic forecast that estimates for us the sales, say, of EVs based on things like the range, the battery size, the purchase price, the cost of electricity, those kinds of like important inputs. And we could estimate based on sort of those past trends and an equation what people might do. And we haven't done that in this model, and probably will not. I think what I would do though is turn that around and say, sort of, we want to use this model as a, you know, as a top-down kind of like a guiding star to say, okay, regardless of those things, how many, like, what is the role of EVs, and how many electric vehicles, what share of the fleet have to be electrified in order to reach the state's goals, say. And we can also generate, like estimates, rough estimates for what the cost of that will be based on the cost of those vehicles. But then it's sort of, you know, the state's job to decide, okay, well, how are we going to hit that target based on all of the sort of the things that you just mentioned, George. So, and I think it's that latter approach that we're taking with this model, and really that sort of fits into, or that is the main objective, I guess, of this model. Does that make sense?
It does. I think there's a lot of fuzziness in any of this stuff, of course. There's probably a whole science about how you do market research and make forecasts of future sales of some widget. But there's an additional layer of complexity, I guess, from a public policy perspective, that you would like to have everybody come aboard, not just those who can afford it. And that issue, I think, will become more and more prominent as you go further down the road, because people who can afford it will do it first. You know, I'm currently looking at a bid from a contractor to install a heat pump system here in our house. And I had the means by which to just say, yes, I'll go do that. And someone else would scratch their head and say, well, I'll just replace the propane boiler with something that costs initially just $5,000 less, or more than the heat pump system, but nonetheless, in the long term, is going to be the best choice.
Yeah, thank you for that, George. I definitely agree with you in that as we take the results and how it's apportioned out, and how the costs, what portion of costs are public costs versus private cost, and how we move forward. I think that absolutely makes a difference in terms of take rates. You know, Teslas were getting a lot of takers at $70,000, but that was a certain class of customers, right?
I'm not one of them.
So I definitely understand that point, and thank you for raising it here.
All right, thank you.
I don't see any other hands up. Any other public comment today? So hearing none, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you sticking through. Thanks again, Taylor, for the presentation. That was great. And welcome to Gabrielle and David. Look forward to working with you in this committee and going forward. And to the public for sticking it out as well, George and Mark. Very much appreciate it. Until next time, I think we can adjourn.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Everybody. Bye.